in front of 3,000 world leaders and broadcast live to over 50 million viewers. One question from Ibrahim Traoré stopped Barron Trump cold. You could feel the tension, no teleprompters, no spin, just raw truth. What did he say that no American president's son ever dared to answer? The private jet sliced through the pale sky like a silent blade, descending into the snowy cradle of the Swiss Alps. Outside the cabin window, jagged peaks shimmered beneath a sheet of mist and ice, their crowns dusted with centuries-old snow. The silence was almost wholly a stillness so crisp it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Inside the jet, President Ibrahim Traoré sat upright, arms folded across his chest, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He had seen jungles burn, cities crumble, and entire peoples disappear from maps. But this frozen white silence was foreign. And not just geographically. Davos, a town where power wore scarves and smiled through teeth bleached by privilege. A place where words like development, innovation, and partnership danced on polished stages, while resource pipelines bled his continent dry. This wasn't just another summit. This was the stage. And waiting on that same stage was Barron Trump. Traoré exhaled slowly, not from nerves he didn't believe in them, but from memory. The heat of Burkina Faso's sun still burned behind his eyes, even here in this land of frost and ceremony. The memory of dusty roads, of his mother's coarse hands pulling weeds from cracked earth, of soldiers in unmarked trucks circling villages like vultures, it all came back now. The wheels touched down, a faint jolt, then another. The world moved again. On the icy tarmac of Samadan Airport, the Swiss security detail stood flanked like chess pieces, neutral, polite, but impossibly alert. Cameras clicked like falling snowflakes. Behind barricades, reporters murmured, unsure whether to shout or wait. Traoré's motorcade had been requested without ceremony, but secrecy had only drawn more attention. Is it true he plans to respond to Barron Trump's keynote? Will he walk out, confront him? What's the African delegation's actual stance? Nobody knew, and that made them desperate to know. Wrapped in a dark wool coat, Traoré stepped onto the tarmac, a sharp contrast to the surrounding whiteness. The Burkina flag pin gleamed on his collar, not polished gold, but forged iron, handcrafted by a local artisan. His security moved swiftly but silently around him, their presence both subtle and solid. Every movement was deliberate, every glance measured. Cameras didn't just watch, they fed, and he knew the power of an image. Just days earlier, an article in The Atlantic had called him Africa's reluctant lion, young, sharp, and increasingly impossible to ignore. And now here he was, not in Paris, not in Addis, but in Davos, where the air was thin and the egos thinner. As his car glided through the winding, ice-kissed roads toward the summit compound, Traoré sat in stillness. His aide Bakari typed rapidly on a tablet beside him, but Ibrahim's eyes were closed, not sleeping, remembering. He thought of the letter that had summoned him here personally, signed by the WWEF director, hidden beneath a stack of logistics papers. It was formal, yes, but there was a line that stayed with him. We invite your voice, Mr. President, because the world needs more than silence. But silence was not the danger. Barron Trump was. The son of a political hurricane reborn in private equity, wrapped in a calm that was almost eerie. Barron had spent the last 3 years quietly funding a continent-wide data infrastructure, initiative satellites, internet biometric ID programs. He called it the future grid. What he didn't call it was what it actually was: surveillance cloaked as philanthropy. Traoré didn't come to argue. He came to unveil. As the convoy pulled into the sleek, steel-glass hotel compound overlooking Lake Davos, the sun dipped behind the Alps, casting long shadows across the icy waters. It looked tranquil, yes, but beneath the surface, the entire summit buzzed with tension. Traoré stepped out. A red scarf fluttered briefly in the wind, a gift from his mother made from traditional Faso d'Anfani cloth. A journalist whispered into her mic, "There he is. The man they say might derail Trump's grand design." Inside the lobby, sleek men in black suits sipped espresso beside AI entrepreneurs and tech billionaires. Nobody shouted. Power didn't scream here. It hummed, polished, pleasant, deadly. As Traoré entered the elevator, he caught his reflection. Not just a president, not just a soldier, a storm wrapped in silence. And tomorrow the silence would break. The letter arrived not with ceremony, but with quiet precision. Folded within a larger diplomatic pouch from the Burkinabe Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it bore no distinct seal or crest, just a simple cream-colored envelope, slightly heavier than standard parchment, its edges embossed with the minimalist logo of the World Economic Forum. At first glance, it appeared routine and expected formality, like dozens Traoré had received before. Summits, panels, side discussions. He usually passed them on to his deputy or chief of protocol, but this one wasn't routed through usual channels. It had been hand-delivered from the Swiss embassy, bypassing 4 layers of diplomatic procedure. He held it for a moment, weighing its thickness between his fingers. Then with one clean motion, he broke the seal. The salutation was short, respectful, deliberate. President Ibrahim Traoré. We cordially extend this personal invitation for your presence and your voice at the 2026 annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. That was expected, but it was the second paragraph that caught him off guard. In light of recent developments in the Pan-African digital sector, and given your leadership in the Sahel Data Sovereignty Initiative, we believe your perspective will be pivotal during our session, The Digital Future of Africa. There was a pause in his chest, and then as if the letter anticipated his next breath, came the next line. Keynote to be delivered by Mr. Barron Trump, founder of Polaris Technologies. He read that sentence 3 times, and then once more. That name, Barron Trump, had lingered like smoke in the corridors of African geopolitics for nearly 2 years. At first it was whispers, a soft re-entry into global affairs by the son of the controversial American president, now cloaked in the polished language of entrepreneurship. Then came his private meetings with heads of state, offers of zero-interest infrastructure loans, promises of tech parks and satellite coverage across the continent. On paper, it was benevolence. But Traoré had learned long ago that the language of generosity was often spoken in code, and the code in this case read, ownership. Barron's company, Polaris Technologies, was at the center of what Western outlets gleefully called the digital renaissance of Africa. His face had appeared on the covers of Forbes and The Economist, usually accompanied by headlines like "The Next Tech Titan" or "From Legacy to Vision, How Barron Trump is Redefining American Soft Power." But in Ouagadougou, Abuja, Accra, and Nairobi, a quieter narrative brewed. One of buried clauses of ownership agreements that tethered entire nations' biometric data to offshore servers. One of cloud networks that were meant to connect rural schools, but conveniently funneled user analytics to anonymous shell companies in Delaware. Digital colonization, Traoré had once called it, in a closed-door African Union session. A phrase that had earned him both quiet praise and equally quiet threats. Now the battlefield was being laid bare, and he was being summoned, no dare to step onto it. He walked to the window of the presidential residence, letter in hand, as evening spilled across Ouagadougou. The sun dripped molten gold over the rooftops, casting shadows that clung to the red dust below. A warm wind rustled the trees in the courtyard. Somewhere a child laughed. A mother called her home. He could have declined, sent a polite refusal, citing scheduling conflicts or matters of national interest. That would have been the diplomatic route, the safe one. It would have kept Polaris Technologies sponsors content, the American embassy quiet, the media half-interested. But then what let Barron Trump dictate the narrative of Africa's future, uninterrupted and unchallenged, let him sell sovereignty, dressed in algorithms and spreadsheets. No. This wasn't just about a conference. It was about history. It was about standing at the edge of another cycle of dependency and breaking it. He returned to his desk and called Bakari. "Draft a reply," he said, eyes still locked on the fading horizon. "Tell them I accept the invitation. Tell them I look forward to the conversation." A beat, and request to speak. Bakari hesitated. "You want a speaking slot, sir?" "The agenda's all ready, they'll find room," Traoré said. "If not, I'll make it." Outside, the last light of day bled into night, but inside something else had ignited. Not ambition, not ego, purpose. The pre-summit dinner was hosted in a high-ceiling salon carved from the stone and glass, nestled within one of Davos's most exclusive alpine retreats. A constellation of chandeliers sparkled above diplomats, CEOs, and heads of state as they dined on truffle foam and wild reindeer, while string musicians filled the room with the kind of sound designed to disappear the moment it arrived. Ibrahim Traoré moved through the gathering like a soldier on reconnaissance, quiet, focused, absorbing everything. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with no tie, the iron Burkinabe flag pin still gleaming on his lapel. There was something grounded about him, even here among men who'd never known soil beneath their fingernails. He wasn't looking for Barron Trump, but Barron Trump found him. The youngest son of a once thunderous dynasty approached with 2 aides in his wake, dressed in a dark navy suit that seemed deliberately chosen to be unmemorable. His hair was clipped short, his gait unhurried. His face held no smile, just that curious stillness, like a chess player, already thinking 5 moves ahead. They met beside a window overlooking the frozen lake, the Alps stretching beyond like sleeping giants. "President Traoré," Barron said, extending his hand. Traoré accepted it. The handshake was firm, cold, and brief. Neither man blinked. "It's good to finally meet," Barron added, voice smooth, as if reading from a script rehearsed 100 times. "Is it?" Traoré replied, tone even but not warm. A silence passed between them, and then Barron gestured to the lake. "It's beautiful, isn't it? All this serenity. It helps you think clearly." Traoré's eyes didn't follow. "Until the ice cracks." Barron gave a short laugh. "Always so poetic. I've heard that about you, and I've heard you prefer spreadsheets to stories." "Stories are comforting," Barron said, his voice dipping lower, "but not very useful when you're building infrastructure." "You mean buying it," Traoré corrected, lifting a wine glass to his lips. "Or perhaps leasing it until the fine print tells a different story." Barron didn't flinch. "Let's not play the sovereignty game, Mr. President. The world runs on systems, data fiber satellite scale. You can't farm integrity, you have to build it. Efficiently." Traoré set his glass down without drinking. "Efficiency without ethics is just conquest wearing a suit." Now Barron smiled, slow and deliberate. "Africa's future should be efficient, not romantic." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Across the room, someone laughed loudly, breaking the moment. Waiters passed with gold-rimmed trays. The musicians shifted into a new key. Barron straightened his cufflinks. "I'll see you tomorrow." "You're attending the keynote?" "I wouldn't miss it," Traoré replied. "No," Barron said with a grin that didn't touch his eyes. "I suppose you wouldn't." He turned and walked away, his shadow swallowed by the glow of chandeliers. Traoré remained by the window, eyes now locked on the distant lake, where the wind whispered over the ice like a warning. He had come prepared for a summit, but this would be a confrontation. In the gilded corridors of St. Albans School in Washington, D.C., whispers once followed him like an invisible entourage. They didn't say much, not to his face anyway. He was always just there, a silent storm wrapped in tailored uniforms and unshakable calm. Barron William Trump. The name carried weight, but not the kind his classmates admired. He wasn't loud, he wasn't showy, and he wasn't trying to be liked. He never needed to be. He just watched, listened, waited. Teachers described him as unfailingly polite. Students called him the Ghost Prince, always present, rarely known. But if you stepped too close, if you made the mistake of underestimating him, you'd feel it, the chill beneath the calm. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply corrected you with silence, sharper than steel, and a look that told you your opinion had already been replaced. He moved through elite schools and private academies like a shadow through sunlight. Georgetown Prep, Oxford summer seminars, a brief but whispered stint at La Rose in Switzerland. Each institution shaped a layer of him, the rhetoric of diplomacy, the science of systems, the art of war without weapons. And behind him always was the machinery of legacy. His father's name was a continent unto itself, loud, defiant, divisive. But Barron was the opposite, disciplined, unreadable, surgical. Even the media couldn't pin him down. While other heirs chased headlines, Barron kept his movements deliberately obscure. A feature in Time dubbed him the quiet heir of a loud dynasty. Forbes listed him as one of the 30 under 30 to watch, though no one could confirm what exactly they were watching. He didn't care for interviews. When pressed, he once told a Wall Street Journal reporter, "Silence isn't weakness, it's an asset." People rush to fill silence with noise. That's when they reveal themselves. Still behind the silence Barron Trump was building. At 24, he launched Polaris Technologies, a think tank turned tech conglomerate with global ambitions cloaked in minimalist branding and philanthropic press releases. It began with blockchain infrastructure in Eastern Europe, moved swiftly into predictive analytics for climate risk in Southeast Asia, and then suddenly, and with almost surgical precision, Africa. While the world was distracted by military coups and debates over development aid, Barron had moved swiftly to sign long-term public-private contracts across at least 8 African nations. Data center satellite connectivity, biometric identification systems. On the surface, benevolence and advancement. Beneath, sovereignty mortgaged in perpetuity. He wasn't just building software. He was building dependence, a framework so deeply embedded that reversing it would feel like severing a vein. Behind closed doors, Barron was ruthless in a way that his father never was. Not chaotic, not erratic, precise. He didn't insult people, he erased them. Lobbyists, ministers, even shareholders learned quickly if you slowed his momentum, you became invisible. No blowback, no press leak, just silence. Like you'd never been there at all. His boardroom demeanor was legendary: meetings timed to the second, questions cut off mid-sentence, contracts reviewed line by line, with a memory that unnerved even veteran lawyers. He remembers everything one former advisor once told the Financial Times, even the things you didn't say out loud. And yet he was never entirely alone. A small circle of technocrats, military advisors, and geopolitical analysts moved quietly at his flanks, most of them ex-CIA, ex-NATO, ex-something. They didn't attend parties. They didn't give statements. They signed NDAs that practically bled. But for all his silence, Barron wanted something deeply personal, a legacy that wasn't borrowed. He didn't want to be Trump's son who didn't screw up. He wanted to be the architect of a new empire, one not made of towers but of towers of code. Invisible, unbreakable, global. And in that empire, Africa was not a partner. It was the foundation. So when the World Economic Forum invited him to headline the Digital Future of Africa keynote, he didn't hesitate. He accepted before the ink had dried. This was the stage he'd been designing for years. Davos wasn't just a conference, it was a coronation. Or so he thought, until Ibrahim Traoré said yes. Before he was president, Ibrahim Traoré, before he stood beneath marble columns and faced microphones, he was a barefoot boy standing in a field of fire. It was the summer of his 12th year when the soldiers came, men with hardened faces and hollow eyes, shouting orders in a dialect that didn't belong to their land. Their trucks rolled in just after dawn, carrying men and fear in equal measure. No one knew what faction they served anymore. The uniforms changed weekly, the flags daily. That morning they burned the schoolhouse and demanded the village chief kneel. Traoré had tried to stand between them, a stick in his hand, his chest heaving. 12 years old and already willing to break, the barrel of a rifle pressed to his temple. But then his mother stepped forward. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She walked slowly, wrapped in a fading blue wrap skirt, in a headscarf that smelled of wood smoke. Her hand reached for his, gently pulling him behind her. Her other hand clutched nothing but a prayer bead, clenched so tightly the thread dug into her palm. Her voice, when it came, was calm and low. "You can take everything, burn everything, but not our dignity, that you'll have to kill to steal." The soldier hesitated, and in that pause something shifted. A decision unmade, a child unshot, a village spared for now. It was only later, when the trucks had gone, that Traoré noticed the blood on her hand. Not from the soldiers, from the beads. He would never forget that. Years passed. Governments rose and fell. Promises broke like brittle clay under sun. But the lesson remained etched in him, deeper than bone. Dignity is not negotiable. Not for food, not for comfort, not for peace, especially not for peace. By 16, he was in a military cadet academy. Not by choice, but by survival. The barracks were cold, brutal, and riddled with men twice his size and half his faith. They mocked his quietness, mistook it for weakness. Until the night the commander ordered a punishment drill under a monsoon sky, and Traoré, soaked to the bone, was the last one still standing. Knees shaking, fists clenched, jaw locked. From that night on, they called him Fur Iron. But iron alone didn't lead him. He read in secret. History books, political theory, legal documents, borrowed, stolen, memorized by candlelight. He learned how coups were seated not in barracks, but in banks. how treaties masked chains, how leaders became puppets when they mistook applause for purpose. And more than anything, he listened to elders, to farmers, to women, to market vendors. He listened when generals didn't. He remembered names when ministers forgot. It made him dangerous not because he knew how to fire a weapon, but because he understood why people bled. His rise was not spectacular. It was not scripted. He did not beg for votes or flash slogans. He simply acted. When a convoy of foreign contractors bulldozed farmland to make way for a gold mine, he led a quiet occupation not with rifles but with villagers holding seeds in their palms. When a major general funneled aid money into phantom companies, Traoré delivered the files directly to the press. He was stripped of rank, then reinstated, then promoted, each time with more followers than before. He never shouted, he never threatened, he simply endured. When the transitional government finally collapsed under its own rot, the people did not cry out for parties or platforms. They cried out for him. He resisted at first. Power had long been a poison in his country, but the same hands that pulled him from gunfire when he was 12 now pointed toward the capital. So he went. And when he took the oath, he did not swear on a constitution long abandoned. He swore on the prayer beat of his mother, now worn smooth by years of memory. Now as snow fell in Davos and the world whispered about billionaires and algorithms, he walked with that same prayer beat in his pocket. Not for luck, but as a reminder. Because here too they would try to take something, and here too he would not let them. They were born just weeks apart, two sons of two different worlds, shaped by suns that burned with opposite intent. One entered life swaddled in luxury, the lullaby of aircraft cabins and marble floors echoing through his early memory. The other drew his first breath in a home built by hand, where the walls were baked clay, and the only wealth was a dignity passed down in whispered proverbs. Yet now they stood on the same stage. Barron Trump and Ibrahim Traoré, the same age, separated not by years but by vision. Each fluent in the language of power, but fluent in different dialects of truth. Barron believed in systems scalable, replicable, engineered to minimize friction and maximize control. The world to him was a grid of inputs and outputs where human unpredictability was a bug, not a feature. Data could be mined, modeled, monetized. Trust was irrelevant if the code was clean and the contract locked. Traoré believed in people flawed, resilient, complex. To him, a community couldn't be debugged. Its pulse had to be heard in marketplaces and schools, in the spaces where no algorithm could map loyalty or grief. He did not trust systems that operated without conscience. He had seen what they left behind when they failed and who paid the price. Barron walked into rooms with blueprints. Traoré entered with questions. Barron admired the elegance of efficiency. Traoré respected the chaos of culture. Barron found power in leverage. Traoré found it in listening. And yet they had this in common: neither man blinked in the face of pressure. Neither man played for applause. They both understood that leadership was not a performance, it was a reckoning. But reckoning with what exactly was the point of divergence? To Barron, Africa was a frontier, untapped, undervalued, ripe for optimization, a continent with 1 billion data sets waiting to be harvested, organized, refined. The digital future of Africa wasn't a slogan, it was a supply chain, and he intended to run it. To Traoré, that same future could not be outsourced. Not again. Not under another name. Too many contracts had been signed in languages his people did not speak, secured with smiles that masked teeth. If they were to digitize, it would be on their terms, with their hands at the wheel, not as passengers in another man's project. Now both men had come to Davos, not to debate, to decide. Not just the tone of a keynote or the direction of a panel, but the trajectory of a continent and perhaps the soul of global leadership itself. Because beneath the layers of diplomacy, economic modeling, and polite claps awaited a question too large to whisper: who gets to shape the future of Africa, those who live in it or those who invest in it? Fate had not merely brought them here. It had engineered this moment like a fault line slowly widening beneath polished marble floors. Tomorrow the plates would shift, and the world would feel it. The snow outside the summit compound had begun to fall harder by morning, blanketing the Swiss pines in a silence that felt almost sacred. But inside President Ibrahim Traoré's suite, the quiet had no such sanctity. It pulsed with tension, broken only by the soft tapping of fingers across glass and keys, the low murmur of voices reading clauses, codes, and technical jargon that masked something far more dangerous than weather. Bakari stood at the far end of the room, tablet in hand, brow furrowed. We pulled the draft agreements from 3 West African countries, public-private partnerships with Polaris Technologies, all signed under expedited digital development frameworks, all under a 10-year confidentiality clause. Traoré sat motionless in a high-backed chair, eyes fixed on the document projected onto the wall, line by line scrolling like scripture. The headers sounded innocuous: Infrastructure Modernization Act, Digital Access Acceleration Protocol, Intercontinental Connectivity Index. Beneath them, buried in subclauses and legal abstraction, was the shape of something far more chilling. Satellites, biometric ID systems, encrypted educational platforms, AI-based population analytics. On the surface, it was dazzling, like hope wrapped in circuitry. Polaris promised lightning-fast internet to every school, biometric cards for rural health access, and centralized data centers to coordinate agricultural output with global trade algorithms. The kind of plan that would make headlines, win grants, attract young talent back to the continent. But Traoré's eyes weren't drawn to the promises. He was reading the shadows. Clause 42.7, he said quietly. Bakari zoomed in. All metadata collected under this initiative shall be backed up on offshore servers located in Delaware and Zurich for redundancy and security purposes, with access permissions retained solely by the infrastructure provider unless otherwise renegotiated after 12 years of continuous use. 12 years. 12 years of sovereign data stored off the continent, out of reach of local courts, unreachable by African regulators, monetized in silence. They could track migration, consumption, voting patterns, health cycles, even emotional tendencies through educational AI responses, all without needing a single permission from the people generating that data. It's a goldmine, Bakari muttered, half in awe, half in horror. And no one's mining it but them. Traoré leaned back. He wasn't surprised, just quiet, thoughtful. He had seen this kind of power before, not in satellites or smart cards, but in the fine print of colonial treaties from a century ago. Promises of roads and railways that came with decades of debt. Technologies offered as gifts that left nations addicted, then owned. This wasn't philanthropy. It was infrastructure as leverage. He looked again at the branding. Pan-Digital Africa. A name that sounded almost noble, like something crafted by idealistic youth in Nairobi or Dakar. But it was born in a think tank in Virginia, designed not by dreamers but by architects of control. Where does the funding originate? He asked. Bakari pulled up another slide. Venture capital consortium, but with 3 main anchors: a hedge fund formerly tied to the Carlyle Group, an Israeli cybersecurity firm, and an offshore holding registered in the Caymans, connected indirectly to Polaris Technologies. Any African ownership, a symbolic 2% equity share for local stakeholders, mostly ceremonial. Traoré exhaled through his nose. There it was, the old trick dressed in new code. He stood and crossed to the window. The mountains in the distance shimmered, half buried in white. They looked peaceful, but he knew better. Peace was often just a pause in the war for control. They think we don't read, he said almost to himself. They think we'll be blinded by fiber optics and cloud logos. Bakari didn't reply. He didn't have to. Traoré turned back toward the projection. They'll announce this tomorrow. Barron will paint it as partnership, as vision, and the world will clap, Bakari added bitterly. Yes, Traoré said, but not everyone will stand. A silence settled in the room again, no longer uncertain, but deliberate, heavy, focused. He would not go to the keynote to listen. He would go to answer. The room was warm, but the tension made it feel cold. A fire cracked quietly in the hearth of the suite's lounge, but the faces gathered around the low table carried none of its comfort. They were the core of his team: strategists, ministers, liaisons, seasoned men and women who had been with him through transitions and threats, through dark alleys of diplomacy where words could get someone killed. And tonight they were united in one thing: restraint. We're asking you, Mr. President, said Minister Duwamba, his voice calm but taut, to consider the larger picture. Another added, There is a way to challenge the terms without making enemies. A private roundtable, a technical revision committee. You don't have to do this on stage. Not tomorrow. Not like this. They were worried not for themselves but for him. They knew what was at stake. Not just trade deals or headlines, but retaliations, quiet global surgical. Funding pulled. Licenses revoked. Narratives rewritten overnight by media giants owned by those who smiled across the cocktail tables of Davos. Barron Trump is not just a man, one of them whispered. He is a system. Traoré listened. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He just let the weight of their caution settle inside him like snow. Quiet, persistent smothering. And when they left, he didn't speak for a long time. He simply stood by the window watching the reflection of the fire dance across the dark glass. Somewhere below in the streets of Geneva, young people were gathering in cafes and lecture halls arguing politics over espresso and algorithms. Some of them still believed the world could be shaped. Others had already begun to bend. He needed air. The cafe was modest, tucked into a quiet corner not far from the university district. No cameras, no staff entourage. Just Traoré in a scarf and wool coat, walking like any other traveler dodging the cold. He hadn't expected the place to be full. But there at a back table, hunched over a laptop and 3 open books, sat a young woman with deep brown skin and tightly braided hair, her expression locked in the intense focus only youth and idealism could generate. He approached slowly. "Excuse me, may I?" She looked up, blinking, confused at first, then shocked. "You're—" "Yes," he said gently, "but tonight I'm just a man who needs to ask a question." She nodded, stunned, and motioned for him to sit. He did. "What are you reading?" he asked. She hesitated, then showed him. One was a report from the African Development Bank, another a white paper on blockchain infrastructure. The third was a news article headlined, "Barron Trump to Unveil Africa's Digital Future at Davos." "I'm preparing to argue against it," she said, "for my thesis, but I don't know who'll listen. They say the world's already decided." "And what do you say?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked. "I say it's not about whether we go digital. It's about who owns our future when we do." The fire from the hearth upstairs might have faded, but something else ignited here. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "Not of the tech, but of the silence. Every leader they put in front of us folds, or sells, or disappears." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes held their line. "You're the only one we trust to speak truth. If you don't, who will?" He left her, with a gentle nod, no promises, no speeches. But as he stepped into the cold night, something in him had shifted, not in clarity, but in certainty. The next morning there would be cameras, there would be backlash, but there would also be history. And when it was written, he would not be in the footnotes. He would be in the answer. The suite was still, too still. The fire had gone out hours ago, and though the warmth lingered in the walls, it did nothing to quiet his mind. Ibrahim Traoré sat in darkness, untouched by sleep. The hum of Davos outside the windows had faded into the hush of mountain silence, the kind that stretched over the snow like a burial cloth. He rose slowly, shoulders heavy with the weight of the hours to come. Outside, the wind cut sharp through his coat, but he welcomed the cold. It clarified things, stripped away performance. The streets were empty, the high-altitude lights casting long shadows across polished stone and glass. No guards followed. No cameras flashed. Even here, even now, he found a sliver of solitude. He made his way toward the lake. Lake Davos lay still and frozen, its surface glimmering under the silver hush of moonlight. The snow muffled his steps. He moved like a ghost between trees heavy with frost, each breath a cloud drifting behind him. There was something sacred about this place, untouched and eternal, a silence that didn't suppress but revealed. He stopped at the edge of the lake, boots crunching faintly on ice-crusted ground. Somewhere beneath this frozen mirror, water still moved, unseen but relentless. The thought comforted him, and that was when the memory returned. It was 2 years ago, the capital tense and seething after a fuel tax sent prices soaring overnight. Students had taken to the streets. The crowd was loud, angry, young. Some had stones. Others had nothing but voices. They surged toward the ministry gates like a tide no one could hold back. The generals demanded permission to disperse them. Rubber bullets, water cannons, escalation. But Traoré had refused. Instead, he walked out alone onto the front steps of the ministry. No megaphone, no helmet, just a microphone clipped to his lapel at signal broadcast through the city's loudspeakers. He didn't shout, he didn't scold, he listened. And then he spoke not like a leader defending policy, but like a son of the same earth, the same suffering. He spoke of sacrifice, of mistakes, of the pain between intention and reality. He promised nothing immediate, only truth. And slowly the noise receded, the anger cooled, stones lowered. The crowd sat down, thousands of them. Some wept, others just stared. The cameras caught none of it, but the country remembered. Standing now at the edge of this frozen lake, Traoré closed his eyes. There would be no tear gas tomorrow, no barricades, just words. But he knew words could wound, could liberate, could pull masks from empires. He opened his eyes, watching the moonlight fracture across the ice. Beneath the world's still surface, things were always moving. So was he. He turned back toward the compound, toward the warm glass buildings and curated futures waiting to be unveiled at dawn. His steps were slower now, but not from hesitation. He had decided. He would not sit. He would not stay silent. Tomorrow they would speak of networks and access and progress. And he would answer not as an interruption, but as a reckoning. The auditorium at the Davos Congress Center pulsed with low conversation, the soft buzz of anticipation weaving between rows of suited executives, international delegates, and polished media personnel. Every seat was filled. Some attendees stood along the walls, arms crossed, not wanting to miss what had been billed as the defining vision of Africa's digital century. The room itself was sleek, futuristic curved panels bathed in soft white light, a massive central screen flickering with abstract data, animations, lines of code moving like constellations across a starless sky. Spotlights floated gently across the crowd, as if choreographed by a sentient machine. A voice came through the sound system, cool, British, emotionless. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Barron Trump, founder and executive director of Polaris Technologies. Polite applause swelled and fell. Then the lights dimmed slightly. A single spotlight moved to center stage. He walked out with the casual elegance of someone raised under ceilings that never crumbled. Dark suit, no tie. Confident posture. His hair was combed with precision, his face expressionless except for a hint of calculated warmth. Behind him, the screen bloomed to life. Africa 2.0 scrolled across the top beneath it. Integration, intelligence, infrastructure. He waited just long enough for the silence to ripen before he spoke. Good morning. The two words echoed, gently received like gospel. I stand before you today, not as an outsider, but as a builder, he began. Not with promises, but with systems. Images shifted behind him, maps of Africa glowing with fiber lines, satellite overlays, population heat maps animated in real time. The colors pulsed in perfect rhythm with his voice. For too long, we've treated Africa as a space of need, a continent defined by its problems. But we see something different. We see potential measured in data points. We see people not as challenges, but as contributors in a digital future, one that starts now. Another screen appeared, an AI-generated simulation of an African village, transformed solar panels, drone deliveries, children holding tablets with biometric ID logins. A soft orchestral score hummed beneath his narration. Our Pan-Digital Africa initiative is already laying ground infrastructure across 10 nations. Over 500,000 kilometers of fiber planned. 34 satellite nodes launched. 27 national databases integrated with next-gen encryption. And our first AI-powered predictive model is already improving health response times in West Africa by 34%. Applause. He smiled briefly, letting the rhythm build. We don't just want to connect Africa. We want to optimize it. We want to make it efficient, predictive, resilient. Behind him, new phrases bloomed like code from a hive mind. Smart health, biometric identity, agricultural forecasting, blockchain voting, scalable governance. Each word echoed the last, feeding off its precision. No metaphor, no soul, only forward motion. He continued. Through our partnership frameworks, local governments retain operational flexibility while Polaris Technologies safeguards the integrity of infrastructure systems. Translation. We run the code. You use it. He didn't say that. He didn't need to. The audience was rapt. Some nodded with admiration. Others tapped notes into tablets, already imagining licensing opportunities. Cameras clicked. Hashtags trended. Hashtag pandigital. Africa was already rising across platforms. Barron stepped slightly forward tone, shifting towards something more intimate. We are not here to dictate identity. We are here to enable it securely, transparently, permanently. For a moment, the auditorium fell entirely silent. Then the applause rose again, longer this time, measured, respectful, from some even enthusiastic. A few looked around the room, searching for the African delegations. Some clapped with caution, others remained still. At the very back of the hall, seated in the shadows of the final row, President Ibrahim Traoré watched without expression. His fingers were folded neatly in his lap. His eyes did not blink. And though he said nothing, his silence had begun to gather weight like a tide quietly pulling back before the wave breaks. Barron Trump was halfway through his second case study, a biometric-powered public health rollout in Eastern Africa, when it happened. He stood stage left, now speaking without notes, gesturing toward a rotating 3D map of Senegal's digital health grid. His tone was perfectly modulated, his cadence sharpened by hours of rehearsal. Behind him, predictive charts animated in real-time disease reduction curves, demographic overlays, smiling nurses and stylized infographics. He was in control, almost, until something shifted. It was so subtle at first it barely registered. A quiet ripple in the back row, a pause in the rhythm of silence. Then came the sound of a chair sliding back across the floor. One man stood, no microphone, no signal, no announcement. Just a figure rising slowly from the shadows at the far end of the auditorium. Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't move forward. He didn't raise his hand. He simply spoke. His voice was deep, unhurried, unamplified. And yet somehow it cut through the room like wind across glass. With all due respect, this is not Africa's voice. The words fell heavy, too heavy, like stone dropped into still water. The audience stilled. Tablets froze mid-type. Pens stopped scratching. Barron hesitated just a flicker, as if an unexpected pop-up had appeared in his code. His eyes searched the back of the room, and for a moment he simply stared. The spotlight above didn't reach Traoré, but that made it worse. The voice emerged from darkness, from the edge, from the very place Barron's model had conveniently left out. The moderator at stage side stood halfway from her chair, unsure whether to intervene or vanish. Barron finally responded, the smile returning thinner now. "President Traoré," he said, measured, cordial. "I'd be happy to yield the floor in just a few moments. I believe I'm still within my allocated," but Traoré didn't wait. He took one step forward, then another. Still no microphone. Still no raised voice. "You speak of Africa as if it were a machine, a puzzle to be solved, a circuit to be completed. But we are not an input. We are not an endpoint, and we will not be optimized." A few delegates exchanged glances. Somewhere, a journalist's camera began recording slowly, carefully. Barron's fingers tightened around the podium edge. "I assure you, Mr. President, this initiative has included dozens of consultations with regional stakeholders and national consultation." Traoré interrupted is not consent. Now the silence deepened. The kind of silence that precedes storms. The kind the earth makes just before it splits. An organizer near the front gestured urgently toward the AV technician, but the technician froze. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't protocol. This was something older, unwritten, untouchable. In the back of the hall, Traoré continued forward, walking slowly down the aisle. Step by step, word by word. "You speak of networks, but networks without sovereignty are not solutions. They are shackles with better design." He was near the midpoint of the hall now, his voice still carrying without strain. It wasn't loud. It was just true. What good is speed if it carries us further from ourselves? The screen behind Barron remained frozen on an animation of smiling children, holding tablets now eerily still. A slideshow of futures suddenly disconnected from their context, their authorship. Barron remained silent. The audience did too. For the first time that morning, no one clapped. They simply watched, as if something larger than a keynote had been broken. as if something far more real had just begun. The room held its breath. Barron Trump remained frozen beside the podium, his presentation forgotten, the next slide abandoned in a flicker of motionless light. All eyes had shifted from him to the man now walking down the center aisle. Not with fanfare, not with entitlement, but with the steady cadence of inevitability. Ibrahim Traoré did not ask permission. He did not look at the organizers. He did not pause for security or ceremony. He simply reached the edge of the stage and stepped up. His coat still hung from his shoulders. He wore no headset. No microphone was clipped to his lapel. And yet, when he turned to face the hall, his voice carried low, deep, unhurried. The kind of voice people didn't just hear, but felt. "I come with no slides," he began. "No graphs. No animation. Just a memory and a mirror." The room stilled, locked in the grip of something unscripted. "My grandfather once told me," he said, "that when foreign men came to our land with compasses and flags, they didn't arrive with chains. They arrived with maps. And those maps told us where we belonged, where we didn't, who owned what." He took a breath, scanning the audience. They watched him, silent. Barron stepped back. "Today, those maps have new names: cloud storage, predictive analytics, biometric grids. But the purpose is not new. It is to shape us from elsewhere, to track us, index us, make us legible to systems that were not built to understand us, only to use us." The screen behind him flickered again, caught between Barron's slideshow and the unexpected present. A logo lingered: Polaris Technologies. It looked suddenly fragile. "We are not data points to be harvested. We are not a testbed for artificial intelligence. We are not a sandbox for secondhand empires trying to be born again," in softer voices with better fonts. Now the words began to move through the audience, not as argument, but as truth remembered. "Yes, we welcome innovation. Yes, we seek progress. Yes, we will digitize, modernize, globalize. But we will not do so with a leash at our throat." The line landed. Clean, sharp, undeniable. Somewhere near the front, someone clapped softly at first, then another, then a cluster. "Partnership is not ownership." Traoré continued, not raising his voice but deepening its gravity. "Connection is not control. Investment is not destiny. And sovereignty is not outdated. It is the very thing we carry into the future. Or we carry nothing at all." Now more applause. A wave rising, a woman stood, then a delegate from Kenya, then a young tech entrepreneur from Ghana, wiping the corner of his eye. The room was no longer still. It was alive. Barron stood off to the side, his face unreadable, arms folded. The podium was no longer his. The spotlight had shifted, not just in light, but in legitimacy. Traoré let the silence return, just for a moment, and then, with nothing left to prove, he stepped back from the podium. Not bowed, not proud, just finished. And in his wake came a thunderclap of applause, slow and rising, not the kind that follows performance, but the kind that follows release. From fear, from pretense, from silence. They did not just clap, they stood. The moment the standing ovation began to peak before the final hands even came together, Barron Trump was already moving. He stepped off the stage without a word, cutting through the wings like a man walking out of his own theater. His jaw was tight, lips a flat line, eyes fixed ahead. The hall behind him echoed with rising applause claps, not meant for him, not anymore. His team scrambled to follow. Inside the secured green room, the atmosphere changed. The pristine calm shattered. No more polite nods. No more tech-branded optimism. Now there was only controlled chaos, and at its center, Barron seething like a silent storm. He tore off his lapel mic, handed it off with a sharp flick of the wrist, and turned to his communications director. Why wasn't he vetted? His voice was low but lethal. He wasn't scheduled. You didn't see this coming. No one did, sir. He wasn't even registered to speak. Barron turned toward the glass wall. Beyond it, the Alps stood quiet and still, mocking him with their permanence. His reflection stared back, creased, now imperfect. For a man who had engineered control at every level, this moment felt like corrosion. Another aide entered, face pale. Reuters and Al Jazeera have picked it up. Headlines are already spinning it as what Barron snapped. The aide swallowed. As a reckoning, Some are calling it a turning point. Hashtags are trending. Hashtag Africa Speaks. Digital sovereignty, Traoré unchained. Barron looked at him like he was a broken screen. Then he laughed. But it wasn't humor, it was static. Within the hour, the damage began to crystallize. Several of Polaris Technologies' pending infrastructure contracts worth hundreds of millions in projected rollout value were reportedly being reviewed, paused for consideration by ministries in Senegal, Ghana, and Malawi. One European media house ran a segment titled, "The Emperor Has No Bandwidth." Another released leaked footage of Traoré's speech with an overlaid quote, "We welcome innovation, but not with a leash." Shares of Polaris parent holdings in New York dropped 7% in overnight trading. A venture fund that had just finalized an AI partnership announced a temporary reevaluation of the alignment. Worse still, tech influencers, those same online warriors who had once praised Barron's cleaner capitalism, began to fracture in real time. Some doubled down, others disavowed. One former ally tweeted, "Maybe we should have listened to the people living in the places we're trying to optimize." Back inside the suite, Barron sat alone now. The lights dimmed, his phone silent. His chief strategy officer paced behind him, voice thin with fury. "He ambushed us. That was international sabotage. It was premeditated, and you can bet he coordinated it with that data ethics consortium in Berlin. They're probably drafting a sanctions advisory as we speak." Barron didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, somewhere between the precision of numbers and the unpredictability of people. Somewhere between the slick terrain of strategy and the sudden fracture of meaning. For the first time in years, he hadn't seen it coming, and that meant something in him, something cold and quietly dangerous, was beginning to turn. He walked slowly to the window, stared out at the white blankness beyond. He had underestimated not just Traoré, but the emotional currency of sovereignty, the fire it could light, the way it could burn through code. But this wasn't over. No, he hadn't spent years building this empire to lose it to a speech. He would regroup, reframe, rewrite the story. But next time, he wouldn't just bring data, he would bring leverage. By nightfall, Davos wasn't just trending, it was on fire. Screens across continents flickered with one name, one image, one line that refused to die. "We welcome innovation, but not with a leash." CNN led the primetime broadcast with bold white text stretched across the bottom of the screen. "The African lion roars in Davos." The anchor's voice carried a kind of reverent disbelief. In what many are calling the most unexpected and unfiltered moment of the World Economic Forum, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso disrupted the keynote address of Barron Trump to deliver what some now call a 21st century declaration of sovereignty. Clips from the speech played in looping succession, his unamplified voice, the chilling stillness of the room, the standing ovation like thunder on ice. Not to be outdone, Fox News delivered its own framing. Disrespect on a global stage. Their panel of guests debated whether Traoré had violated the spirit of diplomacy or exploited the platform for political theater. One commentator raised a hand and said flatly, "Look, this was a power grab dressed as moralism." The man hijacked a private summit and embarrassed an American innovator. You think China's not watching that? With a smile across the Atlantic, the BBC's coverage struck a more analytical tone. The speech heard around the system. They brought in historians, economists, and cultural theorists. One guest, a former UN envoy to West Africa, stated simply, "We are witnessing the emergence of a new geopolitical grammar, one that no longer accepts being spoken for." But the real explosion came online. Within hours, Twitter, rebranded now as X, was flooded with hashtags, hashtag Traoré Unplugged, Africa Unfiltered, Not Your Data, and simply Ibrahim. The African diaspora lit up like a constellation long waiting to be seen. Influencers in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Atlanta streamed live reactions. A Ghanaian tech entrepreneur declared, "That wasn't just a speech. That was ancestral memory brought to Wi-Fi." Memes emerged in real time. One showed Barron's frozen face beneath the words, "When the algorithm doesn't predict resistance." Another featured Traoré's silhouette overlaid with a quote from Thomas Sankara. Even old voices re-emerged. A retired French diplomat wrote an op-ed titled, Deja vu in the digital age warning that Africa has once again reminded Europe that it cannot be managed, it must be heard. Tech publications spun up emergency newsletters. Investors held quiet calls. Advisory firms rushed to draft narrative containment strategies for clients with deep stakes in the global south. And then came the interviews. Traoré declined all major Western requests. He granted only one, a 15-minute segment with a young female journalist from Nairobi, streamed by an independent Pan-African news collective. In it, he smiled gently and said, "If the world truly wants to partner with Africa, they must first listen without holding the pen." By the end of the interview, the stream had been watched over 12 million times. Meanwhile, Barron Trump's media team launched their counteroffensive. Their statement emphasized respect for passionate voices, while reaffirming Polaris Technologies' commitment to transparent partnerships and global data equity. But the phrasing felt distant, corporate, bloodless. For the first time, his precision couldn't outrun the story. The world was no longer asking for charts. It was asking for answers. The summit compound had quieted to a whisper by the time Traoré returned to his suite. The day's thunder had passed cheers, headlines, backlash, rebuttals. All of it now floated somewhere, in the frost-bitten stillness outside, swirling through the corridors of power like drifting snow. Inside, the lights were low. The fire burned faintly in the corner, casting soft shadows across the stone floor. He stood by the window, one hand on the sill, eyes tracing the outline of the mountains barely visible beneath the night sky. He hadn't changed out of his suit. His scarf still hung around his neck, slightly wrinkled, still carrying the scent of cold air and applause. And yet, as the room settled around him, so did the question. Was it worth it? He hadn't planned to speak. Not like that. He had known what it might cost. Polaris's retaliation, diplomatic fallout, 100 quiet doors closing without ceremony. It would come, maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but it would come. He had fractured something people spent lifetimes building a performance of consent. He had broken the script. And silence, even righteous silence, did not always protect you after that. He lowered himself slowly into the chair near the fire. No papers, no screens, just the crackle of flame and the weight of breath. For the first time in 2 days, he allowed himself to feel tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from motion, but from meaning. His eyes were beginning to close when the phone rang. It wasn't his public line, just a quiet tone from the encrypted handset lying face down on the table. He blinked once, then reached for it. No caller ID. He answered. "Bonsoir," he said, voice hoarse. There was a brief pause, then a soft, accented voice on the other end. "President Traoré? I hope I'm not intruding." He sat up. The voice continued, warmer now. "My name is Zassi Mandela. My grandfather once said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Today you reminded us of that. You reminded us who we are." He didn't speak. Couldn't. In my generation, we often feel like we inherited the shape of liberation, but not its soul. Today you gave it breath again. Another pause. "Thank you. That's all I wanted to say." Then the line clicked. She was gone. He stared at the handset in his palm for a moment longer, as if the voice still lingered inside it. Then slowly he smiled. Not the smile of victory, not even relief. It was the smile of a man who had found confirmation, not in policy, not in polls, but in something far older. Remembrance. He stood once more and turned toward the window. The wind had picked up. A light flurry danced beneath the dim street lamps. Far away, the machinery of retaliation had likely already begun to spin. But for now, here in this room, there was only the flame. And the knowledge that the storm he had stirred wasn't one of chaos, it was clarity. And it was just beginning. The first tremor came quietly. A single press release from the office of the President of Kenya, brief, neutral in tone, but seismic in meaning. In light of recent concerns regarding data governance and public-private equity transparency, the government of Kenya is suspending its partnership agreement with Polaris Technologies pending full parliamentary review. No dramatics, no finger-pointing, just a quiet withdrawal. But in a world addicted to signals, it was louder than thunder. Polaris had spent 3 years cultivating that deal, a cornerstone initiative involving a national biometric ID rollout, data infrastructure for rural health centers, and predictive analytics for agricultural supply chains. Hundreds of millions. Tens of thousands of hours. Dozens of lobbyists. Gone. Just like that. Within hours, Reuters confirmed that Ghana and Uganda were revisiting similar contracts, citing unanticipated geopolitical optics. At Polaris headquarters in Zurich, the board convened behind closed doors. The company's public-facing website was updated with a new banner, "We stand for secure, sovereign shared digital futures." It wasn't enough. The tremors had become waves. In Brussels, a proposal passed unexpectedly through a European Parliament subcommittee, a resolution to establish a joint Afro-European Council on Data Ethics and Sovereignty. What had previously been an academic suggestion now landed with real urgency. Germany threw its weight behind it immediately. France followed the next day. Even skeptical Nordic nations voiced interest. The language had changed. Where once the conversation was about digital opportunity, it now revolved around digital consent. It wasn't just contracts being reconsidered, it was the architecture of influence. But it wasn't only happening in palaces and boardrooms. On the streets of Bamako, Dakar, and Ouagadougou, something else was rising. In West Africa's sun-beaten capitals, the youth had taken to the streets not in rage, but in recognition. They didn't shout slogans for party loyalty or bread. They carried hand-painted signs with phrases like, "Data is gold," "Africa owns it," "We are not your testing ground. We see you. We decide." University students marched beside farmers, tech workers beside market vendors. The protests were fluid, self-organized, largely peaceful. In many places, police simply stood back and watched, unsure whether they were witnessing disobedience or awakening. In Accra, a group of engineering students held a symbolic data cleanse ceremony, pouring sand over printed EULA's end-user license agreements from major Western tech firms while reciting excerpts from Traoré's speech. In Lagos, a viral video showed a teenage girl reciting word for word the now famous line, "We welcome innovation, but not with a leash." By dusk, that video had been viewed over 8 million times. Polaris Technologies, for its part, went quiet. Its communications team released a 3-paragraph statement reaffirming its commitment to local collaboration and ethical infrastructure, but failed to address the core concern: control. Meanwhile, Barron Trump had disappeared from public view. His last appearance, a clipped, unsmiling interview on CNBC, left viewers divided. Some saw resolve. Others saw something unraveling beneath the surface. But none of that mattered now, because the message was no longer in the boardrooms. It was in the streets. It was in the classrooms. It was in the air. And far from it all, sitting quietly at the edge of a compound in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré watched the headlines scroll across a small tablet in his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But in his silence now, there was something different. It wasn't defiance. It was confirmation. The boardroom was perched high above Manhattan, a steel and glass crown overlooking a city that had once called his name with awe. Now the view offered little comfort. Screens lined the wall, most muted, a few cycling through market updates. The glow from the Bloomberg ticker danced across the table like silent static. Around it sat half a dozen senior advisors, general counsel, and PR operatives. None spoke, because Barron wasn't speaking. He sat at the head of the table, elbows on the armrests, hands folded loosely. His suit was immaculate, but his posture was not. His shoulders slouched just enough to betray something unfamiliar: heaviness. The silence stretched. Finally, the head of investor relations broke it. "We've had 3 deals rescinded since Monday. The Nairobi rollout is officially dead. Berlin's Privacy Oversight Council just issued a strategic hesitation memo, and Nigeria's new ethics committee is calling for a full audit." Barron didn't blink. Another added: "Private equity's pulling back too." Softly, but it's happening. There's chatter about reputational volatility. Volatility. That word had never applied to him before. Not publicly, not internally. He was the stable one, the silent one, the controlled iteration of a once chaotic legacy. And yet here he was, watching his own system reject him like a bad line of code. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and hesitated. Then he stood and stepped into the adjoining office. He answered. His father's voice came through, older now, slower, but still edged with steel. "You let him play you." Barron didn't respond. Back when I ran things, I knew when to cut 'em off. You give 'em too much rope and they think they're the cowboy. Barron stared out the window, jaw tight. Then after a pause, the elder Trump's voice softened. Just slightly. But sometimes, he said, you don't need a wall. Sometimes you need to listen. That silenced even Barron. I didn't, the voice added almost ruefully. Maybe you still can. The line went dead. He stood there unmoving for a long time. When he returned to the boardroom, the others looked up, waiting for commands, plans, orders. He sat down slowly. What if we've been framing it wrong? He asked aloud, not to anyone in particular. They blinked. He glanced down at a legal folder marked with the name of yet another suspended partnership. Then he closed it. What if this isn't a PR crisis, he continued quietly, but a design flaw? No one answered, because no one expected him to ask a question. Not like that. Not ever. The air in Ouagadougou was warm and thick with the scent of red dust and charcoal smoke. Children shouted in the distance. A rooster crowed even though the sun was already high. Inside a modest sand-toned building on the outskirts of the capital, Ibrahim Traoré stood in front of a mismatched audience. Some wore jeans with laptops slung in canvas bags. Others came barefoot with soil still under their nails from morning work in the fields. There were no cameras, no global press, no stages with LED backdrops or curated applause. Just rows of plastic chairs filled with coders, farmers, students, and the occasional elder, watching quietly from the back. Traoré stood without a microphone. He didn't need one. I've been to places where the world speaks, he began, his voice steady. But today I've come back to a place where the world listens. A murmur of approval moved through the room. They heard us, he continued, not because we shouted, not because we begged, but because we spoke with dignity. He looked at a young girl in the front row, her shirt emblazoned with the words, Local Server, Global Power. She nodded, eyes bright. The world sees us now, he said slowly. The question is, will they respect us? A pause. Respect doesn't come from exposure. It comes from preparation, from participation, from creating, not just consuming, from owning not just our land, but our data, our stories, our futures. The room was silent, not out of hesitation, out of attention. You, he said, pointing gently, you who write code under candlelight, who irrigate fields by hand, who speak 2 languages by age 8, you are not behind. You are becoming. A breath. Let them build networks. We'll build nations. There was no need to shout, only to plant. And already beneath the surface, roots were growing. The sun rose slowly over Ouagadougou, washing the capital in soft amber light. It filtered through the trees and rooftops, brushing over vendors, setting up stalls, and children racing to school. And just beyond the market square at the edge of a quiet park, something new stood tall against the African sky. Not a statue of a man, not of a hero with a fist raised or a general on horseback, but of words. Etched in burnished bronze and mounted on curved stone, the inscription was simple. Progress without dignity is slavery in disguise. Davos 2026. There were no cameras at the unveiling, no press kits, just a modest crowd, students in uniforms, mothers with babies tied to their backs, elders leaning on carved sticks, all gathered in silence. A little boy tugged his father's shirt. Why isn't it a statue of President Traoré? The father crouched and smiled gently. Because the words last longer than the man. Nearby, a group of girls snapped a photo of the monument with an old phone. One of them whispered, "One day I want to say something people remember." Another replied, "Then speak like you mean it." The monument had been proposed not by the government, but by a group of university students. They crowdfunded it, debated the quote for weeks, even fought over the font. In the end, they chose the words that had lit the spark that cracked the mask of diplomacy wide open and reminded a continent that it was no one's experiment. Every week, more visitors came. Some took selfies, others stood silently for long minutes. A few wept. Foreign dignitaries visited too, quietly, unannounced. One European ambassador stood before the monument with folded arms and whispered, "It should be required reading in Brussels." And still Traoré had never once mentioned it. He passed by occasionally in an unmarked car window, cracked slightly. He never stepped out. He didn't need to, because the message had already stepped forward. The envelope arrived without warning. It was hand-delivered by a neutral courier from Geneva. No seal, no emblem. Just thick paper, ivory white with the president's name, in simple cursive across the front, Ibrahim Traoré. He held it for a moment, weighing the silence it carried. Then he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably American, neat, sharp, deliberate. President Traoré, I've never written a letter like this. I suppose I don't write letters at all. My advisors would tell me this is unwise. They'd ask what the upside is. But some things aren't about leverage. You changed something in Davos. Not just the room, not just the news cycle, but my perspective. You made me see something I never saw before. I grew up around power, around winning, around the idea that if you didn't control something, it would control you. So I tried to own everything, data, strategy, outcomes. But I never thought to ask if owning was the same as belonging. You made me stop and look and listen. I won't pretend we suddenly agree, but I will say this: thank you for speaking truth when silence would have been safer, for choosing dignity over diplomacy, for making me rethink what kind of architect I want to be. I don't expect a reply, but I wanted you to know I heard you. Barron Traoré folded the letter once carefully and placed it in a leather-bound journal he rarely opened. Then he looked out the window toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to slip behind the baobabs. He didn't speak, didn't call anyone, just smiled. A small one, quiet. Not because he had one, but because even the most fortified hearts had doors, and one had just cracked open. The cold bit at his cheeks as he stepped onto the frozen path once more. The same lake, the same mountain, silent and eternal, but the man who walked there, not the same. It was late January, 1 year to the day since Davos had frozen in breathless silence beneath his words. Now the summit hummed in the background speeches on climate equity, youth innovation, circular economies. But Traoré had not come to speak. He had come to walk. Beside him strode a familiar figure, the young woman from Geneva, the student who had once told him, "You're the only one we trust." Now she wore a badge clipped to her coat, Senior Policy Advisor, African Digital Trust Commission. She laughed as they walked. "It still feels surreal. I sat in your audience. Now I sit in negotiations." "You earned it," he replied. She kicked at a patch of snow, thoughtful. "People say you changed everything." He stopped, eyes on the horizon. Then he looked at her, calm and warm. "No," he said simply. "We did." She blinked a little, taken aback, then nodded slowly. They stood there in silence, the lake before them. Beneath the ice, the water still flowed, always moving, quiet, relentless. And just beyond them, on a bench half buried in snow, someone had carved 4 words into the wood with a penknife. "We are no one's shadow." In the halls of power, the debates would rage on. Treaties would be signed, others torn, futures rewritten in code and compromise. But here, beside this lake, 2 generations stood shoulder to shoulder, one who had spoken, one who had listened, and together they had become the echo that wouldn't fade, not because of applause, but because of truth. What happened at Davos wasn't just a political confrontation, it was a reminder that truth has its own power, even in the most polished, controlled rooms. Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak for applause. He spoke for dignity, for a future where Africa is not a data mine, but a voice in the room. And perhaps most surprisingly, Barron Trump listened. Maybe that's how change begins, not with thunder, but with quiet cracks and certainty. True leadership isn't always about who has the microphone, but who dares to speak when silence is safer. Now let me ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment when someone spoke up for what's right and it changed the room? What did it teach you? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.